Hi, okay, so this is the third episode of my podcast, and in my mind, I'm like, well, I did those first two episodes, and when I do them, I'm like, oh, that was okay. And, but the thing is that as I look back on them, then I realize that they're total shit. And it doesn't matter if they were objectively total shit. I'm just saying that from my perspective, I understand as time goes on that, oh, actually, it was terrible. Because that's just the way that I feel about it. The more that I think about it by default, the more that like, maybe that has something to do with just thinking about it at all. Like maybe you just naturally reflect on things that you did. Maybe you just naturally reflect badly on the things that you did in the past if you're reflecting on them at all. Because if you are thinking about the things you did in the past at all, like probably the best way that they could ever possibly be is just the way that they happened when you did them. And if you were able to let it be, if you're able to let your actions rest in peace, that's probably the best way that you can think about them rather than trying to rewrite them. But you can think about them again. It's just that I'm thinking, like, that's an argument to me. Is it every time that you think about something that happened in the past that lessens the real impact of it to you? Because the best way that it could possibly come across is just if you let it happen and then let it go. Probably. That's probably the way for you to feel the most positive about it. But you can, like, obviously you would think you can recall a memory and remember. Maybe it's just as long as you remember them positively. But pretty much any time that you're fixating on a memory, that's a negative thing, probably, if you're fixating on a memory. But, well, maybe it just has to do with if you're thinking about how you did, if you're thinking about how it went, if something you did, how did it go? Anytime it's in that category, then it is negative. How did the thing I do go? Did it go over well? That is automatically negative. Because what conclusion could you possibly arrive at when you're thinking about that past thing? Like a presentation you gave. Like, oh, did it go well? If you're asking yourself that, you yourself think that it went poorly. But I digress. I digress from nothing, because this is pretty much what I started talking about was this subject. I don't digress. So what am I saying? I'm saying that if you're like, how did it go? It's not like it went bad to other people, but to you, it's something that you have to try to make right, apparently. It's only at the point that you're like, whatever, that you can let it go, right? So, and you do that with all your memories. That's the thing. Like, if you're thinking about a memory, you're not letting it go, even if you are thinking about it positively. Like, if you're thinking about it, you're not letting it go. You are living in the past a little bit. So it's not a bad thing to think about a memory positively, but it does keep you from moving forward to some degree. But nobody is absolutely able to not think about the past or anything like that. So it's not a vice to reflect on memories, and especially to reflect on them positively, but it does keep you from moving on to some degree. And depending on what your expectations are for moving on or for accomplishing things, then you should view it as worse when you are living in the past and only reflecting on memories. Because if half the time you spent is reflecting on memories and thinking about that things could have gone better in your life, if half of your energy is put towards that, like that's what you talk about, if just half of that's what you talk about or half of that's what you think about, then you are half living in the past. And there's something to be said about where you are in relationship to the present and in relationship to reality and to the people around you. If half of your energy is spent in the past and is spent in a time that other people aren't a part of, you know, and because if half your energy is spent in the past, like, your past is specific to you. So if half your energy is spent in the past, that's like half the time you are entirely selfish because you're living in a reality that only you know about, and that you're the only one that is consistent through that reality is your past. You're the consistent element through your entire past, and besides that, you are the more that you are living in the past, really, besides that, you are doing that, like, you are doing that because you're trying to make things better and remember a more perfect outcome for yourself, when there isn't possibly a more perfect outcome, because the only outcome that there is already happened, and that is the best possible outcome by default. What actually happened in the past is the best possible outcome by default because it's the only outcome. It's what actually happened. And so you can't go into the past and try to make things better, because that's madness. That's insanity. You know how everybody in the world thinks they're cool because they know that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again that you did before and expecting a different result, and that's the definition of insanity based on somebody's opinion. Like, we don't need to limit ourselves to whoever it was that originated that opinion of insanity, because there's many different opinions for insanity, and the reason why we then are drawn toward this one and we're interested in it is because it's pretty relatively truthful. It's a good definition for it, but there are plenty of definitions out there, and the reason why we want to have a definition for it is because it is an undefinable thing, insanity. Like, that's something that everybody could have a perspective on and have a different definition on, the same way like everybody has a different definition on leadership. Like, leadership is undefinable, and you know that because they ask that in interview questions and there's always a different answer. It's something that everybody has a different perspective on. What is leadership? And I feel like insanity would be the same thing, but it's not like that's going to have the same focus that leadership does, because leadership is seen as something that we should try to attain, and insanity is not. But what was I saying? I was saying that insanity was, like, insanity is like another definition for it besides that one that everyone knows, is you trying to make perfect things that already happened, or trying to rewrite the past is basically insanity. Because when you're rewriting the past, you're trying to make something perfect that is already imperfect, but more so than that, something that has already been perfected because it's already happened. The most perfect that it'll be is the way that it happened, because the way that it happened is actually something that happened, and therefore is something that's perfect. And that's what the present affords you the opportunity to do, is to, anything that you do is something that is perfect in a binary sense, because it's something you did rather than something you didn't do. And because it is something you did, it is a 1 as opposed to a 0. It's something you did as opposed to something you didn't do. So it's 100% a thing rather than 0% a thing. And since it is 100% a thing, it's perfect in a binary sense. And a binary sense is a perfectly acceptable viewpoint for your actions. For you saying, did I do it or did I not do it? Especially because that's the only way that you can track your progress as a person, or understand your real standing with other people, or your standing with yourself from the past into the future. The only way that you can understand that is to track the things that actually happened, and the things that actually happen are the only things you can actually keep data on, things that happen in reality. So you have to start taking data on things that happen in a binary sense, meaning things that happened, that at least happened rather than didn't happen. It's only things that happen that you track data for. And it's only if you did it that you know that you are like improving towards some sort of goal. Like, did I do it or did I not is basically where it starts, you trying to achieve any goal that you have. It's just a yes or a no, but it's a number of yes or no's over time. And so that's where we are. And who knows about the direction of this country? I had a conversation with a guy. Part of being president, one of my favorite things is that I get to travel all over this country and meet all kinds of different people and hear all kinds of different stories. There's a man in Iowa just last week. He told me that his daughter had a father who had a daughter. And there's stories like that all across this country. Just last week, I met a man who had a cousin who drowned. And we need to get this economy started again. If you're ready to get this economy started again, honk twice. I wish. So I did the second episode on identity. If I actually upload it, because like I don't like it. We've only begun to extrapolate the idea of identity and really just get in there and dig in and learn from it. That's my agenda. My agenda is to flesh out everything that there is to flush out on identity. Because this is what I want. This is my goal. This is my creed. These are my dictates. These are my demands. And you will listen to me and you will respond. By the way, and I never say this, like anybody that actually listens to this, I'd appreciate if you comment, because I don't want the podcast to just be my thing, like it's just me talking. I do want it to just be my talking from this end where I'm recording it. I don't want somebody else talking while I'm talking over my speech, because that would be difficult. But it might be one of the first podcasts that does that. 4 people talking at once into separate microphones, their own stories, their own cadences, and their own methods of survival. We're all just trying to survive. This is the survival podcast, and we're all just trying to survive. I'm going to tell you how to make a backpack. I'm going to tell you how to make a whole roll of toilet paper out of common household items. I mean, anyway, I want people to leave comments, because I think it would be really great if this was like we were trying to arrive at some sort of greater conclusion, rather than that you're listening to my words as true. Because I have a secret for you. The things I'm saying aren't true. They aren't absolutely true. And since I am a human, the only truths that I'm capable are finite ones, and the only truths I'm capable of are in absolute truths, and the only truth I'm able to understand is an absolute one. I'm not able to understand absolute truth. I'm able to understand relative truth, and that's what everybody is only capable of understanding. So it should be our goal to achieve relatively higher truths as individuals and as a society. But so I say that what I'm saying is wrong because it is relatively false, as long as it is relatively truthful. Because since the things I'm saying are not absolutely true, they are and finite, and this is a property of finiteness, of finite ideas and finite people and worlds and civilizations, is that they are both positive and negative at the same time. And they're both positive and negative at the same time because they are finite, meaning they are not infinite and they are not absolute. They're not absolutely true. So the things I'm saying are both relatively true and relatively false. But they are, as far as any one statement I say, it is, you want it to be more relatively truthful. And so that's a scale from false to true, relativity. Relativity explains a scale from false to true or a scale from 0 to 1, because everything that is, if you're talking about 4 things that are all relative to each other, they exist as related to each other, meaning that they are subject to each other, or they are subject to, there's some sort of hierarchy involved where the 4 are subject to each other. There's varying levels of subjectivity and of authority. So if there's 4 relative elements in a group, there's a hierarchy there, and there's a leader, there's second place, there's third place, and there's fourth place. But more importantly, if they are all relative to each other, then they are all relative to each other's authorities, be it outside of them or the authority is theirs and they are over people, whether they are subject to people or they are the subjector. Whether they are the subjector or they're the one being subject, they are all related and in the group, and therefore, since they are all related, they are all in one group. They have to be in one group. So any number of elements that are considered relative to each other are all in one group. And since they're all in one group, they are as defined in a space between 0 and 1, where 0 is no group and 1 is one group. And so since they are within the group, they are within a space 0 to 1. And that is technically, you can technically view that as percentages. So the person in second place has authority over himself and then 2 other people of the 4-person group. So he's like the 75th percentile. Okay. But that's not, I don't really know what it means to think of it that way, because I haven't really thought of it that way. I'm just spouting something right now, because the point that I wanted to make is that everything you say exists in a space between 0 and 1 and is somewhere between 0 to 100% truthful, while at the same time being between 0 to 100% untruthful. That's everything that you say. And what I described to you is a spectrum. The spectrum is the space from 0 to 1 that is representative of a group from 0 to 1 that goes from 0 to 1 one way while simultaneously going 1 to 0 the other way, and the spectrum contains all relative elements. Okay. So spectrums are interesting, and they're pretty extraordinary. They're extraordinary because they contain all the relative elements, and you can see all of them at one time as long as you have defined the spectrum. So the visible spectrum contains all relative elements, and it always contains infinite elements if it's not for a finite group. So something like the visible spectrum is a spectrum that contains infinite elements and goes from 0 to 1 one way, and it goes from 1 to 0 back the other way. But another way of saying that is that it goes from 0 to 1 the other way. It just goes from 0 to 1 in a negative sense as opposed to a positive sense. So I'm talking about spectrums. I'm really going to do this now. I'm going to talk about a spectrum. This is a spectrum, and it is, so I'm talking about them. And you might have to, I don't know if I'll keep having to explain what a spectrum is, but it doesn't matter. It's not like there has to be a moment in time where I explain the spectrum. Like, oh, I already did that. I'm going to keep explaining it always because this is an important frame of reference, and that's what it is. That's why it is important, is because somehow it is a frame of reference when frames of reference are supposed to be finite. Yet we have, with a spectrum, a possible frame of reference that is infinite when we do not understand infinity, because a spectrum contains infinite relative elements when it is not a spectrum describing a finite group, like a group of 4. Get a spectrum for a finite group out of your mind, because that's not important for right now. So a spectrum, so like the visible spectrum has infinite relative elements, being all the visible colors. And it goes from 0 to 1 in one direction, and then whatever direction you've defined that goes from 0 to 1, the opposite direction you can also define as 0 to 1. It's just 0 to 1 in a negative sense. So in a way, a spectrum has a positive 1 overlaid with a negative 1 at the same time. It's just that the positive 1 is going in the opposite direction of the negative 1, and whichever direction is positive and whichever direction is negative is up to you. It's arbitrary, because you can define either direction as negative or either direction as positive, so long as whatever one you define as positive, you have to define the other direction across a spectrum so you as negative. If you define the first, so if you define left to right across the visible spectrum, and hopefully you can picture a spectrum in your mind. If you define left to right across a visible spectrum as 0 to 1, then you have to define right to left as like the negative side, as 1 to 0, sort of. But the point is that it has to be negative in the other direction, and that's a property of a spectrum, is that the elements left to right are always the reverse of the elements right to left. But the important thing is that they are the reverse of each other. And so the order is opposite left to right on a spectrum than the way it is right to left. And by property of the word opposite, two opposites are not, neither opposite is better than each other. Empty is not better than full, and full is not better than empty in the eyes of the word opposite, because from the perspective of the word opposite, they are both opposites of each other, and neither one is better or considered positive or negative. And that's the same thing as how the elements in a spectrum are ordered left to right are the opposite of the elements in a spectrum ordered right to left. Either one can be positive or negative. It's just that when you define one direction, you have to define the next direction to be the opposite. So the actual direction in a spectrum doesn't matter. And that's another important property of spectrums, is that it's a existence where two directions at the same time are possible. And in real life, you can't have that, but that just goes to show that spectrums are more extraordinary, because they're describing an infinite space, and we don't know anything about an infinite space. All that we know is a finite space, because everything around us is a finite space, and our frames of reference as people are finite, and we can't escape from that. Our frames of reference are finite, and like we can only see so far, for example, and we can only know so far at one time. Even if we consider infinity numerically, we can really only ever have a picture of, like, we know vaguely what up to 100 is, because we've run over that pathway enough times in our mind that we understand 100 really without having to think about it. Like 0 to 100, we have a good picture for that in our mind. We don't have a picture of what's happening in the billions, if you're just considering all numbers on a number line. So our frames of reference are finite, and our communication is based around our finite frames of reference, and we can only go anywhere in finite increments, because we only know things from a finite frame of reference. But a spectrum describes an infinite space, and in an infinite space, there is a certain lack of direction, being as that neither direction left to right or right to left is better than the other. When in a finite space, there's only ever one direction, and you can only ever define one direction if you are communicating something coherently about finite space. Like the wind blows what direction? It doesn't blow two directions at once. And you are going to go one direction. You're not able to go two directions at once. But in an infinite space, we see that one direction is exactly overlaid with its opposite direction. So we're describing something that by definition has two directions. But so the 0 to 1 that I'm talking about is when it contains infinite relative elements, you are television element relatelevant. Do you elephant Ella Fitzgerald relatelevance? You got your television teletubby Speak of the devil. Speak of the devil. Speak of the devil. Relatelevant. Speak of the devil. Relatelevant. Speak of the relative. Joke's on you. Joke's on you because this isn't a podcast. Oh, I was talking about spectrums? Not anymore. Now I'm talking about Ella Fitzgerald relevance. That's how you pretend to know what you're doing. Combine two words and say them over and over again. Well, so I'm talking about spectrums. And I'm talking about how they go from 0 to 1. And I didn't explain why the visible spectrum goes from 0 to 1, and I'm getting to that. But the 0 to 1 in any spectrum represents the direction that a spectrum goes from false to true. And then 1 to 0 would be true to false. But it's only true to false as the negative of what you define the false to true to be, as the negative of what you define the 0 to 1 to be. So, and that is true for all spectrums that contain infinite elements, but anything is a spectrum that contains infinite elements, because there is a spectrum that exists between scrambled eggs and sunny side up eggs, and that spectrum is all the possible all the different kinds of eggs that can be made as different points between scrambled and sunny side up. And that would include, like, so you'd have to think of what's it take to make a sunny side up egg and what's it take to make a scrambled egg. And then think of all the different formations of eggs that exist between those two things. Like, picture a sunny side up egg slowly transitioning through multiple transformations into a scrambled egg. And then picture a scrambled egg transforming back into a sunny side up egg. That's one direction of a spectrum, from the sunny side up egg to the scrambled egg, and then from the scrambled egg back to the sunny side up egg is the reverse of the spectrum that you defined to be from sunny side up to scrambled. And in that case, you defined sunny side up to be the beginning of it, so you defined it to be 0. And then you defined 1 to be scrambled because it's a spectrum from sunny side up to scrambled. And you could have done it the other way. That's fine. And you could have made sunny side up true and scrambled false. But you would have just had to, on the way back, understand that scrambled would have been true and sunny side up would have been false. That's hard to describe, and that's why I keep describing it. Why the reverse is, like, you probably have a general idea of what I'm saying. But anyways, and I bring up the scrambled eggs point to say that spectrums exist in any two things that you want to talk about. Like, what is the spectrum from a table to a chair? Well, think of every possible transformation from a table transforming into a chair, and then a chair transforming back into a table. And that's the spectrum from table to chair. And it is one direction overlaid with another direction, but neither direction is more true than the other. They're just from false to true. and then true to false. So the 0 to 1 that I'm talking about always is from false to true. So for the visible spectrum, 0, for the visible spectrum from left to right, which is from red to purple, or from low frequency to high frequency, the 0 in that case is frequency. And then the 1 is also frequency. The 1 is wavelength. It goes from frequency to wavelength ultimately, because the most no. Okay, so I need to explain this better because I realized that I explained it poorly. Go back to the eggs example. So you have a sunny side up egg. You have the spectrum from sunny side up to scrambled eggs. Those are the 2 points on your spectrum. Think about the autism spectrum. It goes between 2 points and 2 opposing points. What I'm talking about are 2 opposing points between sunny side up and scrambled. Now, they aren't directly opposing to each other, but in this case, we are setting them as opposite to each other by putting them as the 2 bookends of a spectrum. Because from the transformation to sunny side up to scrambled, from sunny side up to scrambled at the other end, is you saying that you've arrived at something that is the least sunny side up of all relative transformations of sunny side up eggs on the spectrum, because every transformation from left to right, from sunny side up to scrambled, contains some amount of sunny side up in its definition. It is at least a little bit sunny side up all the way until it is scrambled. And at the point it reaches the very extreme bookend, to the point that it reaches the other end, scrambled is the only point that it is 100% not sunny side up. Every other relative transformation, which there are infinite possible formations of eggs between scrambled eggs and sunny side up eggs, every other possible transformation besides the one that is absolutely scrambled is at least some percent of sunny side up. Okay, I wish that I said over easy at the beginning of this, because now I keep having to say sunny side up over and over again. But that's okay. That is the cross I bear. We all have crosses to bear. This is the cross I bore. That I could have avoided it. And back to the beginning when I was talking about the past, it's better to realize that that's just what I said. But here's the thing. I live in the present and I can change it. I could be like, well, it's to over easy, but I'm not going to do that because I've already said the example one time and now I'm going back to it to explain it better. So if I change it to over easy at this point, I'm dead in the water as far as my explanation, if I'm not dead in the water anyway. So anyways, from sunny side up to scrambled, every single possible transformation is at least some percent between 0 and 100% of sunny side up. Every one of those transformations is. But at the same time, every single one of those transformations is at least some percent scrambled. And that's where you want to look. That's when you're looking at it in the other direction. And every one of those transformations is at least some percent scrambled, except for the far extreme end where we started at sunny side up, because that represents absolutely sunny side up. So a really important part of spectrums is that the 2 bookends of it, the 2 defining points, the things that you're saying are the definition of the spectrum or the reason that there's a spectrum at all, those communicate absoluteness with regard to the definition of the spectrum. So you have at the 2 bookends of the spectrum of the example I'm discussing, you have absolutely scrambled and absolutely sunny side up. Every single relative transformation between those 2, and there are infinite of them, consist of a percentage of both sunny side up and scrambled, and that's what a spectrum is. So if you consider the autism spectrum, and that one's easier to think about than sunny side up and scrambled, that one goes from not autistic to autistic. And every single transformation from not autistic to autistic is some percentage of not autistic and autistic. It's both of them at the same time. They are finite points, And the two absolutes with regard to that spectrum as defined, and that one is defined as the autism spectrum, are not autistic and autistic. And so when you start at not autistic and then you cover every element on that spectrum all the way to autistic, every single one of those transformations includes every single point on that spectrum is at least somewhat not autistic or some percent not autistic, and every single transformation is also some percent autistic, except for the two extreme ends, which are ideologically, like they are representative by name, also not autistic and autistic. And yeah, so the question is, where do I fall on that spectrum? And the jury's still out. We're determining it. We're trying to figure it out. A team of 23 has been commissioned in order to figure out what transformation on the autism spectrum I'm a part of, and we're trying to get that information to you as soon as we can. But anyway, so anybody that is considered autistic that is on the spectrum is, as you can think about it, is somewhere between not autistic and autistic, meaning that they are a percentage of both of those. They are, and in that case, not autistic is, I'm going to label that as false and autistic to be true, so that everybody that exists finitely, which is on that spectrum, which is anybody that is considered at least somewhat autistic, is a percentage of truth and falseness with regard to autism. So they are some percent false and some percent truly autistic. Yeah, so you'll want to keep that in mind. So with regard to the visible spectrum, it goes from frequency at one end to wavelength at the other end, because if you're considering it left to right, so left to right for the visible spectrum is from red to purple, which is an area of low frequency to an area of high frequency. But the reason that you title the bookends of the visible spectrum frequency on one end and then wavelength on the other end, on the purple side of it, frequency on the red side of it, is because the element on the visible spectrum that has the lowest frequency is the one the farthest to the left and is the extreme of frequency for the visible spectrum, for visible light as defined. So the least frequent element on the entire spectrum is the first element, and then the most frequent element on the same spectrum is at the other end, on the end that we've labeled to be wavelength. And the reason that it is the most frequent element is under the label wavelength is because we're labeling frequency to be 0 in this case and wavelength to be 1, meaning that the least frequent element is at 0, and then the most frequent element is at 0 for wavelength and is false with regard to wavelength, because wavelength from purple to red, from the opposite direction, is the exact reverse order of all the elements in the spectrum, the way that they were ordered from frequency left to right. So wavelength is the least possible wavelength is at the far right, and then the greatest possible wavelength is back at the title frequency is back in the other direction at the red end of it, because the element on the spectrum with the longest wavelength also is the element on the spectrum with the lowest frequency. And so in that way, the bookends of the visible spectrum are frequency and wavelength, where really either bookend could be titled wavelength or frequency. You could switch it so that wavelength is on the red end and frequency is titled to be on the purple end. It's just that you are switching what you are labeling false and true. So either bookend is both false and true. It's just depending on what you choose. So either bookend is representative of 0 or 1, and either direction can be the reverse of the original direction that you defined. So in that way, there's a certain two-ness to a spectrum that is inescapable. It's two things at once. It's a product, no matter what, because even the bookends, which are supposed to be absolutely frequent or absolutely wavelength, can also be absolutely wavelength and absolutely frequency, respectively. While every single element on the spectrum is already two things at one time. So every single element on a spectrum is two things, and it's two things in the same place. And the two things that it is are it's a mixture of positive and negative, no matter what. Where by no matter what, I mean every single element is a product of positive and negative. Even the ends of the spectrum are both positive and negative. And every single element is a different frequency. And then with regard to the visible spectrum, every different frequency represents a different shade of color, and there's infinite frequency wavelengths. Frequency wavelength, that's one of the elements on the spectrum, is like a frequency wavelength, just whatever way you want to describe it to yourself. So every shade of color is like a different frequency wavelength, product of frequency and wavelength. And there's infinite of those on the visible spectrum, like frequency wavelengths, and then there are infinite shades of color. But I was describing that the statements that I make are relatively false and relatively truthful, and because of that, they exist on a spectrum. Because they are finite. Like any one statement I say is relatively truthful, but it's not going to be more. There's going to be stuff that's more truthful than it, and there's going to be stuff that's less truthful than it, and there's going to be stuff that's more false than it, and there's going to be stuff that's less false than it. Any one statement that I say, but I can't say the thing out there that is the most false, because at that point, then I would be the idea of falseness, because it's only the idea of falseness that is absolutely false, that understands the depth of what it means to be false. It's the idea of falseness. The idea of falseness is the only idea that has the authority on falseness enough that it understands what it means to be absolutely false. And the reverse is true for truth. Truth, like absolute truth, is the only idea capable of understanding what absoluteness with regard to truth is, because truth is the only thing that has the authority on truth enough. And since it has the authority on truth, it has the authority on the optimization of truth and what, like, all that truth can possibly be. And so I'm not capable of saying the most truthful thing or the most false thing. So any one statement I say rests on a spectrum between truth and falseness. And that is archetypally what a spectrum should be. It's always, because a spectrum is always between 0 and 1, where 0 represents falseness in regard to whatever is truth on the other end. So an archetypal spectrum is from false to true, meaning that every single spectrum that is possible, any manifestation of a spectrum, goes from false to true. So because of that, the spectrum most relative to all other spectrums, and the spectrum most undefinable, and the spectrum with the most authority, goes from false to true, and every single spectrum follows suit and is made in the image of the creator of spectrums, which is the archetypal spectrum, which is the spectrum that goes from false to true. Because there's only the spectrum that goes from false to true, because I'm saying that a spectrum that goes from false to true is representative of all other spectrums and has the authority on what it means to be a spectrum. And no spectrum can exist that doesn't go from false to true. And then in reverse, like goes from 0 to 1 and then goes from 0 to 1 in reverse back the other way. There's no spectrum that exists that isn't like that. So the statements I say, so it's like when I say a statement and I say that it is relatively truthful, like I aim for the things I say to be the most relatively truthful possible. Now, I could say the most truthful, I could get as close to the truth, like closer to the truth than anybody else on earth. Like there's somebody out there who is the closest to the truth of anybody on earth. But that person is still not absolutely truthful. He doesn't have the authority on truth because whatever he says will be surpassed by somebody else later. Because society is always advancing and we're always discovering relatively higher levels of truth. So you can define truth like in almost absolute sense in the moment. Like, for instance, math and science have the authority on truth in a lot of ways, on what it means for things to be truthful. Like if something is accepted scientifically, it is 100% true. Yet science changes all the time, and what we say is true with regard to science is made to be at least slightly false as time goes on, and we discover better and better explanations for things because like science is just one giant ongoing explanation if you consider it from the perspective of time. So what was true for all of science 100 years ago is false now. But if you look at all reflections of science, like every iteration of science through all of time, there's no absolute truth with regard to science. Like whatever is true with regard to science right now is not absolutely true just because that's what's true right now. It will be surpassed if you look at it from the perspective of time. So the person saying the most relatively truthful things now is not absolutely true. His knowledge and his truth will be surpassed by greater levels of truth as time goes on because society is advancing and advancing technologically, but we're specifying things better and better so as to break down our language further and further and categorize things better so that we can communicate things better. Because when you get more specific categorizations is when you can separate things from each other. Like once you define everything exactly is when you can, and you organize everything, is when you can see clearly what the explanation is for something that used to stand as a mystery. And things that do stand as mysteries are entangled. Like they're entangled with a number of ideas. They're entanglements. Like if it's something that's a mystery, like the greatest unsolved math problem of all time is called the Riemann hypothesis. And it's just a giant entanglement. There's all these ideas, and if somebody can separate every single one of them, then they can maybe start to see the way that the ideas are ordered. I mean, they would be able, if somebody can separate all the ideas that go into the Riemann hypothesis, they will have solved it. Because at that point, they will be able to define every single element of the Riemann hypothesis and communicate what is happening. Like you defining it is you proving it, pretty much. Because when you define it, if you've entirely defined it, every element of it that used to be entangled before has now been brought to light, and you can say with certainty what it is, as long as you've defined it, because definition is certainty, as long as it's certainty momentarily. But since the Riemann hypothesis is a single problem, your certainty momentarily is fine because it's a specific set of definitions that are entangled that we haven't untangled for the Riemann hypothesis. But So that's what a mystery is. It's an entanglement. It's an entanglement of different definitions, and you have to divine them. You have to divine them from each other. And I say divine because divine has to do with, like in Latin, divination, or the verb for divining is prediction, means prediction pretty much. And you have to divine entanglements, and meaning that you have to discern and separate ideas that are entangled, and then in that way see how they're supposed to be defined in order to uncover a mystery, like the Riemann hypothesis. But I use the word divine because you have to divine it, because you have to predict it in a way, because things that are a mystery are, like, an entanglement and a mystery only exists that way in the present. As long as you're able to say that it is an entanglement of different ideas, you're inferring that there are a number of different ideas there that have the potential to be separated. And if they exist as an entanglement, we're just waiting for somebody to divine, to predict it. But prediction, the process of prediction, is one of viewing an entanglement and understanding as time goes on how it will untangle. But so your ability to predict the future is predicated on your ability to understand definitions and entanglements and see through them to understand what's going on in certain mysteries. Like, you have to be able to define what's going on in the mysteries before they are objectively separated, before society comes to a place where they've uncovered the mystery, if you want to be able to predict the future. And I say predict the future like people, like, it doesn't have to be this big thing. Like, predicting the future doesn't involve, like, can you solve the Riemann hypothesis and predict or like understand what it's going to be. Like, so it's like predicting the future. So I'm referring to, like, the leg up that you would have as an individual in predicting over society. And so you can get ahead of society, you can get ahead of other people and, like, be successful and make money, because your ability to make money is in part your ability to predict the future. Like, just think about the stock market. Like, people who just play around in the stock market and make tons of money, they know what the future is about to look like, either long term or day by day. But billionaires like Warren Buffett or whoever, they know in part what the future is going to look like. That's how they make all their money, because they know what will be valuable and what they should invest their money into, and what functions meet a need that like, they meet a need significantly, and what functions are important. They understand what functions are important. But anyway, people who have lots of money are able to predict the future. They're able to control their own future and know where to go in order to make money and all that. So you have the potential to be ahead of other people if you are intelligent enough to look at things that are, according to society, entangled, that you can look at those things and understand how they are in actuality not tangled together. But chances are, if you can do that, society is about to understand it also. But we are constantly unentangling things and defining things better and specifying our language and yeah, we're constantly specifying our language. So I'll say something that is relatively truthful. My goal is, like, the only way that I would have anything to say is if the things that I'm saying are more relatively truthful than what society deems to be truthful. Because at the point that you are saying things that are more relatively truthful, you're saying things that are transcendent in relationship to society, because society is at this certain level of truth, and you have the potential to say things that are at a higher level of truth. And in order to do that, it's not just that you have to. Well, it involves honesty, first of all, because it's really, I would argue, it's really only within your mind that you can understand what greater levels of truth are. Because if you're only ever trying to understand truth as it's presented to you by the world, like if you're only reflecting truth, you're communicating to other people, like the things that you like to say and do and ways that you act are your reflections of truth as truth has been presented to you by the world, then you are simply replicating truth that has been presented to you by the world, because the world operates at a certain level of truth, and most people, like lots of people, just regurgitate to some amount the truth that's been presented to them. But it's not like it doesn't have to be derogatory, like you're regurgitating it. That's just what lots of people will reflect back in their lives, the truth as it's been presented to them by the world. But if you're more inclined to present truth as it's presented by you, then that's it's truth from a different reality than the reality that's practiced by the world, because reality to you and reality as presented by your imagination, like the way that you define everything in the world, is specific to you and is in some ways a different reality it's like a different reality than the reality practiced by the world. That doesn't mean you can't align your reality with the collective reality of humanity. Like you're better off when you do that. It's just that you have the potential to say things out of reality if you aim to harness the power of your mind, if you aim to communicate truth as you see it, as is like really truth as is subjectively true to you, is the only place that you have the potential to communicate things that are transcendent, because things that are transcendent come from unreality. They don't come from reality, because reality operates at a level of truth that is the level of truth, that is reality, that is known and practiced by everybody. If you want to communicate a higher level of truth, you have to visit unreality, and that's like your imagination. Everybody has access to unreality, and it's kind of like the things that you practice and do and say to everybody, and your interactions with the conscious world are your consciousness. And you also have a subconscious, and and that's like people are really wary about that description because it's closer to Freudian, but so I don't base a lot off of that. I'm just saying that that's a good way of describing it. It's like you have your conscious interactions with the real world, and then you have subconscious interactions, and I'm just kind of describing the inner workings of your mind and your imagination, where you define everything in the world, define and categorize it. So in order to communicate things that are transcendent, meaning things that are more relatively truthful than the truth of reality, because reality in the present as practiced by everybody is a certain level of truth that everybody has accepted. It's the most relatively truthful point that we've reached ever in history, but it is waiting to be surpassed by relatively higher truths. And I say that it's the highest point of truth that we've ever achieved is because I am of the belief that society is always advancing, but I don't see where you'd be able to disagree with that based on the timeline of technological development. So I'm saying that we're always getting more intelligent and technology is always advancing. Society is always progressing. We're reaching relatively higher levels of truth. In order for us to reach even higher levels of truth, though, we have to visit unreality, and that is it's self-explanatory, because you have to visit a space that is false and is not true to reality in order to add on to reality. You have to visit unreality in order to incorporate unreality into reality and make it what reality is. Because when we reach a higher level of truth as a society, we've accepted an area that previously was known to be false or misunderstood, or I would say an area that used to be undefinable. But an area that was undefinable is an area that we considered false or out of the realm of reality and definability and rationality. So at the point that we incorporate higher levels of truth, when we incorporate a higher level of truth, a higher authority of truth for our society, we've incorporated something that used to be false and we've made it true. And that's how you reach a relatively higher level of truth. But you have to understand something that is false in order to do that. So you have to define something that used to be undefinable in order to reach a higher level of truth. So what I aim to do is say things that are more relatively truthful than truth as is presented by society. And there are lots of restrictions on that kind of thing. Like there's a lot of argument to be had about somebody who's saying that they want to communicate truth from their subjective perspective. Because public universities now really emphasize that authority belongs with authority figures only. But that's a whole different, the argument between who does authority belong to, the individual or authority figures. Universities do have authority. I'm not saying that they don't have the authority in lots of different areas, especially over academic things. They have the authority over those. I'm talking about the kind of line of thinking that is more liberal, that you shouldn't be interpretive about things and you shouldn't try to be creative. That's kind of a liberal argument. You shouldn't try to do that because it's not based in reality, and they want, if you need truth that's based in reality, you're saying that reality needs to stay the way that it is, but that's just not the way that the world works. The world gets better by incorporating levels of unreality, of reality that used to not be reality, but it becomes reality. That's how we define anything, and that's how we reach higher levels of truth. That's how we mathematically come to understand that negative numbers are allowed to be in mathematics. They're allowed to be on a number line because they used to not be accepted, but we reached a higher level of truth, and now we're like, oh, negative numbers have their place, and we're trying to understand more and more about what that place is. Then that's how we scientifically finally come to understand that time is not absolute, and it is relative to every perspective within the universe. It's not absolute, because we used to think that space was absolute, and we used to think that time is absolute, but now we've reached higher levels of truth and come to understand that space and time are both not absolute, but they are relative to your frame of reference. So those are a few examples. So I aim to say things that are more relatively truthful, but they are, while they are relatively truthful, they are relatively false, especially because there are people saying things that are more truthful than the things I'm saying. There are people with better descriptions of things. Not that, and it's relatively false just because of my limitations. because I am not capable of saying true things all the time. I have limitations. That's why the podcast should be a team effort more so than just me trying to speak as an individual, because the way I view it is that you should communicate your subjective opinion as much as possible, because your subjective opinion, your portion of imagination, your fractional amount of imagination is different from everybody else's fractional amount, and you should communicate that so that you can add truth to the world that didn't exist before, because you have some amount of truth to add. And you should share it, like everybody should share what life is from their perspective, so that we collectively can understand better what life is, and we can learn from each other and that kind of thing. But as long as you're doing that and sharing your subjective opinion, like I want to be able to say my subjective opinion and say that it is true. Because I feel that it is true, and the things I'm saying, I feel that they're true, and I just want to say what truth is to me. And you get into problems because people don't a lot of people are not communicating truth, what is true to them, and so you label those people liars, and then it becomes a game of trying to figure out who's a liar and who isn't, and that's an important factor in the whole thing also. So I want to say what is true to me, but I understand also that I am liable to be corrected for it. And as long as I'm communicating truth, I have to understand that I have limitations and really be attentive to where the things I'm saying are not consistent as brought forward to me by other people. You know, as long as I'm in the business of trying to say things that are more relatively truthful. But in trying to say things that are more relatively truthful, I'm trying to be creative, but I'm not creative if I'm just saying things that are regurgitated truths of the world. If I'm just replicating truth from the world, then I'm not creative at all, and it's not interesting to anybody, and it's not more relatively truthful, and it's not interesting because it's not more relatively truthful, because it is something you can hear from somewhere else. And so if your whole life and your identity is things that other people say and things that, like, it doesn't have anything to do with your truth, what you find, what your subjective truth is, then you don't have value. You don't have value because you're not offering anything that can only be offered by you. And so you don't have any value because the world, they can get that same amount of value from somewhere else in the world if your entire identity is just a replication of things you've already seen. So you should, whatever. But yeah, so the things I say are relatively true, and they are relatively false. They're relatively true, and they're relatively false. Just like, I need to take a deep breath. I think that I'd like to I don't care about making a really long podcast. That's what I should be more interested in. Like, I'm just going to make this one 2 hours. I'm guessing most people, if anybody actually listened to this, they tuned out about 4 minutes into me talking about spectrums. And for a second when I was talking about them, I'm like, I was thinking in my head, I'm going to make this episode, I'm going to title it Spectrums. Wow, wouldn't that be great? I'm imagining how I can sell this to people. I'll title it Spectrums because, like, that's really interesting because people want to know about spectrums. But you do if you understand the whole premise. The reason that spectrums are important, the reason that I emphasize spectrums is to emphasize that, well, at least today it is to emphasize that about that the things I say fall on a spectrum and are a combination of positive and negative. But I like to look at spectrums and try to understand things like mathematically, like what the way that things can be broken down, like the entire operation of addition or the entire operation of multiplication. I would view that as an entanglement. That's a mystery. Addition and multiplication's relationship is a mystery that the world has not discovered. And you can look at something like a spectrum to help you parse what is true about addition and what is true about multiplication, because they are really closely linked, right? Like 1 times 7 is 7, but it's also 1. It's also 7 ones, the same way that in an addition sense, 7 is 7 ones, where it is 1 plus 1 plus 1 7 times. So I want to explain that addition and multiplication are so inextricable from each other that it is like a mystery that we haven't entirely entangled. And I think you can look at something like a spectrum to understand the operations as a whole and try to figure out how they're related to each other. And you can look at a spectrum to help, at least I believe, you can look at a spectrum to try to figure that out, because spectrums say things about absoluteness with regard to like vertical lines and horizontal lines, like what the archetypal vertical line is and what the archetypal horizontal line is. But they say things archetypally about waves and particles, but they do that because the relationship between waves and particles is a product. Like everything, like wave particle duality describes that particle is both a particle and a wave at the same time. But that's the same kind of thing you're describing for an element on a spectrum, where it is both positive and negative at the same time, especially when you talk about spectrums that are between wavelength and frequency. And because you can start to view, because wavelengths are representative of waves and frequency is representative of points. So in understanding that the elements on a spectrum are both a wave and a particle, anyway, it's a description for a different time. I'm just saying that you can use spectrums for important things. Like I like looking at an entire operation objectively and trying to understand its full relationship to addition, like multiplication and addition, because there are better ways of defining it, and we haven't reached those yet. So we have to specify our language more to say, like, oh, addition is actually this, and multiplication is actually this. And you would use things like pi or e or waves and particles, and understand where waves and particles are consistent in the entire operation multiplication and the entire operation addition. But I say that like you would use pi and waves, because a spectrum is actually really, you could pretty much describe it as a circle, and that's for another time too. But so then, as long as you're able to describe a spectrum the same as a circle, then you can start to see that pi is strongly related to the framework of a spectrum. And as long as pi is strongly related to the framework of a spectrum, and pi is strongly related to the framework of a circle, especially in the respect that the relationship of the circumference of a circle to the area of a circle, and both formulas of that include pi. The relationship of a circumference to an area is really almost something you could say as the relationship of addition to multiplication. So I want to provide a lot of context, and spectrums are an important tool, in my opinion, and so I aim to break them down. So, so the things I say are relatively true and they are relatively false. And they're they're relatively false, especially in the sense that if I did say something that was transcendent, it will be surpassed later on. But even if I'm saying things that are new ideas that are true, they have to be true from a number of different perspectives in order to be like objectively true. Because you can say things that are outside of the realm of reality that are not eventually accepted by everybody, and people do stuff like that all the time. Um, that would be the same thing as like a TV show that fails after one season. Somebody had this new idea for a show, but it was not accepted as true by everybody else. So the world did not evolve to include that show in their collective truth. Now, like the Office gets made, and that is extremely popular, but it's extremely popular because it expanded on what we found to be true about our relationships with each other, and like workplace environments, and it poked a lot of holes in like the falseness of workplace environments and that kind of thing, ultimately. And it says a lot about our relationships to each other, and it showed us a higher level of truth than we had understood before. And it did it really, whatever. Yeah, I don't feel like going into that, and I guess I'm just tired and cranky or something. I don't feel like going into it. An hour and a half, and so that's that. And so I'll have a new episode later on. That's all you need to know. It's either I'm going to make another one or I don't make another one. And you'll probably figure it out if I make another one, certainly. So that's the easiest way to figure that out. But I will do that. And I encourage you to comment and tell me the things that I said that are wrong. And also I encourage you to make your own podcast, so that we can all collectively share our truths about life. And podcasts offer you the opportunity to do that as long as you have the courage to just make one. There's no way that you don't have interesting things to say like everybody does, because the only person that can say all the things that you're going to say is you. And so for that reason, I guess you should make a podcast. So you can't defy that logic, possibly. Yep. So, and so it's going to end. And no, you hang up. No, you hang up. And it's a really good content is like a minute of dead air, and I can just edit it out. I can edit it out, but now I'm not going to, because I brought up that I can. So now the podcast is over.